I'd like to welcome everybody to our special session tonight. Our guest is Mr. Jay Kleberg. He is running for the Texas Commissioner of General Land Office, and we're very pleased to have him. I'm going to go ahead and pass this on to Nancy so she can go ahead and introduce him. Okay, Nancy?
Okay. Jay Kleberg grew up on a working ranch in South Texas, and he has spent his entire career in land conservation. He previously served as the Associate Director of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation. Now he owns a land-based conservation business, Explorer Ranches. He also works as an environmental educator and advocate, as a producer of The River and the Wall, a critically acclaimed documentary pointing out the irresponsibility of Trump's border wall from an environmental perspective, and the producer of Deep in the Heart, a Texas wildlife story. Jay is running as a Democrat for Texas Land Commissioner to put the focus of the General Land Office back to where it belongs, respecting the land, funding our children's future, and being a responsible steward, protecting the public and economic health of Texas.
So the General Land Office is the oldest state agency in the state of Texas. It was established in 1836, and it was established initially to manage about 22 million acres of public lands to the benefit of K through 12 education. And that's today about a $50 billion endowment that's called the Permanent School Fund. Since that time, since 1836, now the General Land Office manages about 13 million acres of public lands. 6 million of that is in what's called Relinquishment Act lands, or just minerals. Most of that's in the Permian Basin. There's another 1 million acres in the West Texas area. Most of that's in Big Bend. And then another 4 million that's off the coast. So Cameron County all the way up to Jefferson County, 10 miles out, all the submerged lands there, that's about 4 million acres that's under the purview of the General Land Office. So you've got some oil and gas activity there. What I'm interested in looking at, depending on where it is sited, is the opportunity for offshore wind where that's appropriate. Some of the additional duties are, it has about it has exactly 9 veterans homes, Texas veterans homes, 4 Texas veteran cemeteries around the state. It oversees management of the Alamo and the grounds, and then also about $14 billion in disaster relief funds that come out of the federal government through FEMA and HUD, what are called HUD community development block grants for disaster relief and for mitigation funding. One of the things that's really important to me, I grew up on the coast, not too far from Cameron County. The work that I did in part at Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation was dealing with funds from the Deepwater Horizon criminal settlement. So we did a $50 million deal in Calhoun County, right there next to Port O'Connor, to acquire what was the largest tract of native coastal prairie available on the mid coast at the time. It was about 17,000 acres. And if you may or may not know, there's only about 1% of coastal prairie left in the state of Texas. And so we acquired that with a loan from Deepwater Horizon, and then used that as a model to then acquire lands. We looked at some stuff in Bahia Grande, which ultimately I think the Nature Conservancy ended up acquiring. And then we did some acquisitions all up and down the coast. Follett's Island, which is just south of Galveston. I then was chair of an organization called the Texas Water Trade, which was looking to improve water conservation and availability all across the state of Texas. So anyway, the work that's going on along the coast is very near and dear to my heart. I've been down to Cameron County in the Valley a couple of times now, and the investment that the General Land Office is a part of with the Army Corps of Engineers with the coastal spine, which will be about a $30 billion investment, in addition to the coastal management plan and the coastal resiliency management plan. All of those programs, if you will, are based on weather patterns for the last 100 years. They are not, if you look at the science behind the investment in the coastal spine, if you're familiar with Ike Dike, they've just renamed it basically up in the Galveston Bay area. If you look at the additional investment that the General Land Office and the federal government in the state of Texas will make, not just up in the Galveston Bay area, but all the way down the coast to Cameron, doing dune replenishment and coastal resiliency work, that the standards by which that is set are outdated. Essentially, they are not based on weather patterns that are modeled out for the next 50 to 100 years. So one of the things that I'm interested in is, as land commissioner, ensuring that those investments that we're making are not obsolete on arrival, and that we truly are protecting not just the built environment, ports and cities and hospitals and schools and all of that, but places like Bahia Grande and others around Boca Chica and the rest of the coast. So with that, what I thought I would do is I can just run through these questions, and then if we've got time after that, I'll open it up, or we can kind of open it up as I'm going through this, if that would be helpful. So one of the first questions was in relation to the border wall, and any information sort of related not just to the wall, but also to graft within George P.'s administration. And what I have seen is, one, a complete politicization of the job, of the office. If you've read the Houston Chronicle in the last 6 to 8 months, there have been articles written about the lack of funding, $0. And I was just in Harris County talking with officials there, $0 to Harris County or the city of Houston in disaster relief funds in the wake of Hurricane Harvey. And we all know how heavy hit that community was. And then you even have down in the Rio Grande Valley funds that had still been yet to be distributed from Hurricane Dolly. And that folks that I've talked to who've worked at the General Land Office have said you really need to look into how those funds are distributed. And to your point in the question about the construction industry and making sure that all of that is above board. There is one report that came out in the last, it's been maybe in the last 12 months or so, but about investments that the GLO made in a company that George P. had started before he moved into the General Land Office. It's called Pennybacker. And the General Land Office actually invested in that business. And they held like 15% of the fund. That to me is a direct conflict of interest. And, this is an open seat. And so I don't want to harp too much on the current office holder who's running for Attorney General. But if you look really at the history over the last 20 years of how that office has been handled, it's been mismanaged and politicized and used as a stepping stone to then run for another office. You go back to Dewhurst, who ran for lieutenant governor, Jerry Patterson, who ran for governor, and then now George P., who's running for Attorney General. If you look at my history, and some of that was read, some of my bio, the work that I've done is in land management, it's in natural resource conservation. I have zero interest in doing anything else but this job. And that's the way that I look at it, is a job. And so I appreciate the question about how this office has been handled. And some of the folks that I've talked to that both work within the General Land Office and have worked there previously say that there's a real opportunity to go in and do a full audit of all of the mineral production that's on permanent school fund lands, and ensure essentially that our school children through the General Land Office leases is getting the funds that it deserves. And there's a real, I think there's a delta between, or a lack of enforcement or audit between the big leases and those that maybe are the smaller ones. And it was a tip from somebody who used to work there that suggested doing that day one. And I can stop there for a second, or I can keep going on to the second question if you want.
You can keep going, sir.
Keep going. Okay.
Sure.
So the Coastal Resiliency Master Plan, thank you for focusing in on that. I've talked with folks at the Heart Research Institute up in Corpus, and they put a scorecard together for how we are doing as far as conservation and resiliency investment in the coast, and they do it almost by bay system. And what I would propose for that, for both the coastal management plan and the coastal resiliency plan, is that we partner with an organization like Heart Research Institute, so that not only do we have the plan and that it's based on climate science and modeling that's looking forward, not necessarily that is not considering sea level rise, is not considering a doubling of 100-degree days in the next decade, but that's also collaboratively working with conservation organizations and research institutes to prioritize where those investments are made. One of the part of this question was related to impact on water and habitat and oil and gas activity, the abandoned and derelict vessels, structures and debris program, which is within the General Land Office. That's definitely something that the General Land Office, it's such a cool part of what they do that not many people understand. Not only do they have that, but they also have oil spill response. That's part of their responsibility, and ensuring that proper investment is made in the derelict vessel program. What I have seen the question was also related to LNG terminals and SpaceX, the Jupiter pipeline, is that, especially with SpaceX, the current MOU, as I understand it, and the number of days that are in that current memorandum of agreement between the FAA, the GLO, and SpaceX isn't even being adhered to today. That they are overreaching their ability to shut down that road to Boca Chica. And I was there with someone from your community about 3 weeks ago looking at that. And I had come through there back in 2018 when the first pad site was just being built. And it was, I don't know, hundreds of yards away from the beach. And now this last time that I was there, you all are from that community, so you know better than me, but I was just amazed at how close those launch sites are. I've read the data and the reports that have come out of David Newstead, Coastal Bend Basin Estuaries Program, and piping plovers, and what all of that activity is doing in what is, from all reports that I've read globally, that the Central and Mississippi Flyway that goes right through Cameron County and up the coast, that is the highest volume of migratory bird migration in the world. And that's by number of birds. And so what I would do is I would first ensure that at a minimum that SpaceX is adhering to the memorandum of understanding, and really do some serious science, which I know that Coastal Bend Basin Estuaries is doing, but have that inform the agreement between SpaceX, the county, FAA, and the General Land Office, and ensure that one of the General Land Office's primary responsibilities is to ensure that our beaches are open and clean, and that they take that into account as they look at those investments from SpaceX. And then as far as the LNG terminals and oil and gas activity goes, I think that the primary responsibility of the General Land Office is to generate funds from, as far as oil and gas goes, is both in the mineral leases that it has in the Permian Basin, ensuring that any new lease that we sign, we are capping methane emissions or ensuring that there's no venting, and that we're recycling and reusing water. That's part of any new productivity out there. And then anything that touches the seafloor on the Texas coast, that we are playing an active role in the conservation of our bays and estuaries. And so that's the position that I would take. And I've seen some of that in the Port of Corpus Christi, at least, where the General Land Office has really looked the other way, and looked away from realistic reliable local science that's saying you are essentially going to damage permanently the nursery for the Gulf of Mexico, and that we need to make sure the General Land Office is a partner in conservation and isn't one that's fighting, for instance, the Endangered Species Act in Central Texas that's protecting the golden cheek warbler. So I've got a long history in conservation, in caring about the environment, and I've stood up for the environment, as you said, with the river and the wall, because I just know how precious it is, and that we cannot take it for granted, and that everything that we love about Texas and everything that is so attractive to our economy and quality of life is rooted in our environment, and that if we don't protect that, then we've really lost everything. So I'm just going to touch on, you talked about climate change and the effect of our coastlines. I'm going to actually be on a Zoom here, I think it's tomorrow, with one of the lead climate scientists at the Department of Defense. And what they are saying, the Department of Defense, is one of the greatest threats to our military around the world is climate change. And that I see that certainly there along the Texas coast, that you're looking at the potential of losing 30%. And this is not just from the natural occurrence of longshore drift or the currents that come through in a kind of a counterclockwise fashion in the Gulf of Mexico. This is sea level rise, that we could lose 30% of our beaches in the next 50 or 60 years. And so if we're doing all of this investment to quote unquote fortify the Texas coast through the coastal spine and all of that, that again, making sure that the science on which we're basing all of this investment and resiliency in both a built and a green living coastline, that we're basing all of it on reliable science, that we're not closing our eyes and saying, trust me, we're going to invest all this money and these communities are going to be healthy and strong. That if you're not basing it on good science, then really it's not you're not being a good fiduciary. And the other thing, I just want to talk real quick about ecosystem services. And I think one of the things that the General Land Office can promote is what value truly are these ecosystems providing to the Texas economy, and not to always put dollars on it. And I don't mean to do it that way, but for some people to really realize that you've got 25% of the Texas population along the coastline, that we are a Gulf state, that people forget that. They think that we're just a state with a coast, but we're actually a coastal state. That's extremely important, not just to the population, but also to our GDP. It's roughly 25% of our gross domestic product as well on the coastline. And so ensuring that not only people understand the value of the coast, but also provide opportunities. So if you're looking at carbon sequestration, if you're looking at carbon credits in that market, that there's real value in oyster reefs, for instance, and artificial reefs, and what they do to provide services, ecosystem services that aren't necessarily always, from a dollar and cents standpoint, but that's true resiliency along the coast in terms of storm surge, and taking the state of Texas from being the #1 emitter of CO2 in the nation to one that's at the bottom of that ranking. And so that's something that is a part of our platform, and I continue to talk to people about, because it's extremely important, and it also is something that most people don't really truly understand. So you asked the question here about how the Land Commission would face up to the oil and gas industry. What experience do I have that would be effective in leading the General Land Office? And then a little bit about my background in terms of the effectiveness. How would my background help me be effective in this role? So I've said I've been in land management for about 20 years. I did some of that in El Paso with a real estate company that was doing work along both sides of the border from Tijuana to Juarez down to Monterey, and then on the Texas side and New Mexico side. Worked within that business for about 8 years. And then I went to business school at UT, and at UT, I studied social entrepreneurship. And then I ended up getting a job between year 1 and 2 with the National Park Service. And I did a business plan for the Grand Canyon National Park. And there I saw how my real estate background, my interest in conservation from work that I had done in the Amazon for about 3 years, to my business background could really be deployed for the benefit of the public, and seeing real conservation, real public access, real public lands at scale. Because, you know, in the state of Texas, we've only got about 5% of our land is publicly owned, and about half of that is accessible to the public. So if you look at Boca Chica, you look at South Padre Island National Seashore, the Big Thicket, all of our state parks, the 200,000 acres or so that you've got between Laguna Atascosa and all of those public lands along the Rio Grande, plus Big Bend, Guadalupe National Park, Palo Duro, all of that only encompasses about 2.5% of the state. So what I realized was that's really where I wanted to focus my time and energies. And I became associate director for Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation. While I was there, we raised $100 million for conservation, for public access. We opened up a new park. We bought Powderhorn Ranch, which is the transaction that I told you about on the mid-coast. And in that time, I managed about 30,000 acres of land. And in doing so, I had to generate revenue. I had to deal with 80, 90-year-old oil and gas leases. And in several cases, had to actually file to the Railroad Commission to come do cleanup along the coast. We did some remediation. I've dealt with solar. I've dealt with grazing leases and investing in resiliency there along the coastline with dollars from the National Association of NACA. It's a government program for wetlands, essentially. And so I've dealt with funds and land management and work along not just the coast, but really all over the state of Texas. And then I built a company, as was mentioned before, called Explore Ranches, that now has about 1 million acres under its portfolio in not just Texas, but in New Mexico and Colorado, Montana, and California, to try and keep some of this wildlife habitat together, provide landowners with additional sources of revenue, and then also provide more access, because I see that as one of the big failings of this generation, is that as more people move to cities, you have less of a connection to the outdoors, less of a connection to environmental systems, and an understanding that it all fits together, that it all matters, that we have got to have clean air and water and land to sustain us moving forward. And if you haven't had an experience outdoors, then a lot of times you aren't going to vote that way. You're not going to vote in favor of protection or conservation of our natural resources. So with all of that, that's what I bring to the office. This is not about a title. This is not about anything else but doing a job and doing it at scale, because I feel like we have such an opportunity to talk about all the things that we've just covered in the last 20 minutes, but also talk about opportunities in the future for Texas to really lead in the climate economy. And we've done it before. We've done it in wind. We've done it in solar. And now I actually think that we can do it in carbon sequestration and carbon storage and diversification of our energy portfolio and stabilization of our grid, with things beyond just the traditional wind and solar, but even things like geothermal as well. So I'll tackle the last thing, or I can stop because I feel like maybe I've been rambling on here for a little bit. If you have any questions.
I have a question real quickly. This is Joyce Hamilton, member of NCCD, and also have been active in the Save RGV group for quite a while. So I'm really pleased to hear that you went with David Newstead to the Boca Chica Beach SpaceX area. And I heard what you said about emissions and, the importance of, I think you're saying that GLO can have some impact on controlling the level of emissions. What is the relationship between GLO and the TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality? The reason I asked that is that a few years ago, I was at a meeting where the director of TCEQ made, to me, a shocking statement that if it comes down to a choice between the environment and development, of course, we would have to go for development.
Yeah.
And that really, has stayed with me. Now, that's the past director. I don't know the current director, but they are appointees of the governor. And so I wondered what the relationship between GLO and TCEQ is, and whether GLO has enough power to impact some of the decisions that they make.
Yeah, that's a great question. And just in case you see David, I didn't go out with David. I went with somebody else, one of your local representatives. But
okay.
I talked with David after. So he and I have done some work before on the mid coast. And then as I was going down to Boca Chica, I called him. We had a discussion about all this, the piping plovers and everything. And then he pointed me to a couple of papers, and then a CNN, I think, or maybe even Newsweek did a report as well. So in case you see David, I didn't want you for him to think I was telling people you're on the beach
that's
together.
my error. That's my error. Not yours. I will.
But no, so on the TCEQ side, I almost relate it to Railroad Commission and TCEQ are regulatory bodies, where the General Land Office and the TCEQ, I think, play, and where the GLO actually has some backing here. And I relate this to the Port of Corpus Christi and what's going on there with the deepening of the port and with the desal plant, is if anything touches that seafloor. So if you think about either dredging, or if they're going to have a pipeline that's in the water anywhere for the intake and the outtake, that's going to have to at some point touch the seafloor. And that is where the General Land Office can play. And the same goes with the oyster reef regulations, the fight that's going on right now with Parks and Wildlife, is those oyster reef areas are in part under the purview of the General Land Office. The regulation of those leases is on the part of Parks and Wildlife Department, but you got to think of this GLO as your steward of your public lands, and that includes the submerged lands. And so that's in part where the General Land Office can play. They have water quality monitoring systems, water quality monitoring systems all up and down the coast. Those are GLO. And when we talk about the ability to combat climate change and CO2 emissions, not just in the Permian, but we can store, we've got about 700 years worth of Texas industrial carbon emission storage in the submerged lands off the Texas coast. And there's technology that we can use to safely store CO2 10,000 feet down in a saline layer. That's not, you're not going to wave a magic wand and all of a sudden, all of our climate change problems are going to be addressed. But I do think that the General Land Office can be leading the way in these issues, even if in some cases it might be on the margins. You need somebody who's pushing the envelope on some of these things, as long as they're environmentally safe and sustainable.
Thank you very much. Good answer.
May I ask a question? Can you all hear me, or?
Yes.
Oh,
we
yeah.
can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Hi, I'm John Hand. I live in Harlingen. I'm a new member of the North Cameron County Democrats, although I go back to Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale in my history, but I'm not up to date on things. I have some sort of quickish questions and maybe you can bring me up to speed. The Jupiter pipeline, are we talking about the pipeline from where to where?
Yeah, I think that's up from the Permian, unless I'm wrong about that. But y'all may know more than me.
Someone mentioned it. That's why.
Yeah, 650 miles from the Permian to Brownsville. Yep.
Okay, and that's it. Go ahead.
We're resisting it along with the LNG plants. It's worse than they are.
Yeah.
It's right
And,
there nearby.
You've
Yeah.
been fighting LNG for a while, have you not? Like, this
Yes.
is not the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about the pipeline from somewhere to Mexico City through Veracruz? Is that part of your, does your department, would they have something to do with that? This is a natural gas pipeline. You're familiar with it, I presume.
Yes, it would fall underneath it, unless I'm misunderstanding something, underneath the Railroad Commission, because of their purview regulating the oil and gas business.
Yeah, it's
If
got to
there
run.
were public lands through which it crossed,
Yes.
then the General Land Office would essentially be operating as a landowner,
Okay,
and
okay.
would have that stake in it.
Okay. A couple of more, if you don't mind, then I'll get off the screen here. One is, you mentioned the commission. Do you believe that they're shortchanging the school systems in Texas? Do you think that the two schools are not getting their fair and agreed upon share of the funds that accumulate?
Yes. So the General Land Office primarily oversees the permanent school fund lands. That's the 13 million acres, right? They've been generating about $1 billion a year in revenue.
Okay.
But they've only been sending about 650 million to the permanent school fund.
Okay.
And there's a cap on that right now. What I would work to do is to remove that cap. If you're generating $1 billion, then the $1 billion should be going up into the permanent school fund. And then the second thing that you mentioned, I think, or maybe was starting to go to that area, is any new lease on permanent university fund lands.
Yeah.
And then any new lease on parks and wildlife lands actually comes through two boards underneath the General Land Office, on which the General Land Office Commissioner, the land commissioner, sits as the chair. And so we would have an impact there as well on ensuring that we're getting the best deal for school children, not just on permanent school fund lands, but on all the other public lands.
Okay. You mentioned earlier about the work necessary to be done to protect the coast from global warming, whatever you want to call it, and the rise of the sea. Is there a big ticket? Do you have any idea how this could be or should be paid for? Would it require enormous investment on the part of Texans? Would it be a joint thing between private, public, and federal institutions? How would you see that being funded and financed?
So right, the best example that I've got is the coastal spine, and that's $30 billion. 26 billion of that is in a dike system between Bolivar Peninsula and Galveston.
Yeah.
And the rest of that's about 4 billion in infrastructure along the coast. The way that the 26 billion has been proposed to be paid for is through the Gulf Coast Protection District, which is like a port authority essentially that has been set up around the Harris County and Jefferson County areas to be able to tax and then generate funds to ultimately help pay for that infrastructure. 60% of the proposed $26 billion would be federal. And then the remainder would come out of that Gulf Coast Protection District. And then in addition to that, just to kind of give you an example of maybe what another opportunity or partnership might look like, is there's been proposed what's called the park plan, and it's a secondary line of defense which would be built out of existing dredge material, and would help if you had more than a Category 2 storm or you had more than a 12-foot storm surge, right? And that might be actually philanthropic dollars. It's about a $4 billion project with potentially some state investment, but it's for the most part has been proposed as a philanthropic endeavor. So I think you've got some different mixtures of opportunities there.
Okay, the last question I have is the project that you referred to north of Galveston, where you're talking about private, public, and or this.
In Galveston Bay, actually. Yes.
Has that come to fruition, or is that in the proposal stage?
Yeah, there's what's called a chief's report.
Yeah.
And a chief's report is generated by the Army Corps of Engineers. And they, along with the General Land Office, have put together the science and the reporting and the budget and the planning that will be, right, 20 years in the making. The chief's report has been submitted, and it will be voted on, I believe, or be approved rather, by the Army Corps probably this coming summer. But you're looking at 20 years worth of infrastructure.
Sure.
Right. And so we have got to, even if it gets partially approved this summer, that there's an opportunity for the GLO as one of the trustees there to go in and take another look at the science, because that budget number is going to move anyway over the next 20 years. And so there's an opportunity. We're kind of at the early stages of the planning, if you will.
I'm just curious about the people. Are you getting a lot of support from people in the area? Is the support building for this sort of thing?
Totally. Yeah. So Jim Blackburn is one of our supporters. He's at Rice University. He's always also one of the directors and the co-founders of the Speed Center, which is a resiliency modeling program out of the Harris County area. So not just Jim, who's an environmental lawyer and a scientist, but also that community has gotten behind the Gulf Coast Protection District, which was legislatively approved this last session. And I think essentially what you've got is the community saying, look, if we don't protect Galveston Bay and all the petrochemical facilities and all of that's not going away anytime soon, that you're going to have a 90 to 100 million gallon oil spill in Galveston Bay. And to put that into perspective, Deepwater Horizon was 200 million in the open Gulf.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of support. Now, Galveston Bay Foundation, as an example, has written some reports that say that, look, if you're going to be doing this, you're going to be building a dike system, you're going to actually interfere with the natural flow, the tidal flow that's going in and out of that Bolivar Peninsula, Galveston inlet. But they're not totally opposed to the project. They just want for the science to be accurate. And that's where I stand.
Okay. Hey, thank you very much for answering everything. I really appreciate it. I'll get off here so other people have questions, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sally, you had a question?
Yes, I wondered more about carbon sequestration. We who are fighting Jupiter and the LNG plant, they are using the so-called plan for carbon sequestration, carbon capture and sequestration, as sort of an excuse to build more fossil fuel plants. And we're very skeptical. You seem to be very positive about carbon sequestration. Perhaps you're using it in a more general sense and not the oil industry standard. If you could say more.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that what I know about carbon sequestration is you need a point source. And that point source in many cases is going to be an existing power plant, or it's going to be an existing petrochemical plant that's spewing CO2 into the air. And if we have the opportunity to safely store that CO2 that's coming out of an existing plant safely into the submerged lands off the Texas coast, then I would certainly like to look at that as an option, because if we lead the nation in CO2 emissions, that to me at least seems like a good way to transition into the low emission future. But also understanding that we're going to see a drop, and this is in relation to K through 12 funding in the purview of the General Land Office, that a majority of those funds that the General Land Office produces right now is through oil and gas production because of all that mineral acreage. And so we've got to figure out a way to operate responsibly there, to not hurt the funding that we're sending to K through 12 education, but to your point, also not fall back on that, which the General Land Office has been for the last 20 years, and saying, well, it's not really our responsibility because we're just a revenue generator and we're generating funds for school children. What kind of environment are you handing down to those school children? So what I'm looking for are solutions, and not necessarily for us to be providing something that's going to be an excuse for another industry like the oil and gas industry. I'm just looking at it in terms of this is a number that's really bad, which is CO2 emissions. How can we address that and do it in a practical manner?
Nancy, you had a question? You're on mute.
Okay, all right. So, Jay, I want to kind of shift from the environmental issues to political ones for a second.
Uh-oh.
I think one of our biggest challenges in Texas is that the Republican Party has a stranglehold on politics in Texas. How are you going to bring part of those? Are there some reasonable Republicans that you think are going to be on your team on this in this campaign?
I almost think about it not necessarily in those political terms, but like apolitical terms, in that, are there things that we can agree on as Texans, like a healthy environment, caring for our land, funding our school children, supporting our veterans, and like give people a reason to want to listen to you and to want to agree with you. And if they are disgusted with the way that politics is today, that there is one office, and I'm not saying that there are others, right? There are plenty of others, but there's one office that deals with things that as Texans, we all truly care about. And that if you care about those things and you understand the real positive work that this office can do, it's constitutionally mandated. It is a constitutional office. And so when people think that, well, that's just pie in the sky, to think that a Democrat could hold statewide office, the general land office, as a land commissioner, and actually get anything done. And that's not true. Because if you look at where Gary Morrill was back in the 90s and how he ran the office, he had at times Republican governors. And essentially what he was able to do was he started the Adopt a Beach program. He expanded a lot of the environmental programs within the general land office. And that, one, you can say to people, you can actually get some of the things that I'm talking about done. And that if I'm in rural Texas, I was in Midland, I was in Big Spring, I was in Presidio County, and I was talking to people, and honestly, like we had a small gathering, for example, and I'm pretty sure that 99% of them were Democrat. But I also didn't like ask every single person, what party do you affiliate with? You just don't, I just don't do that. And I knew that there were people there from the Texas Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, for example, and they're generally very conservative. And I said, these are all things that you care about. And why wouldn't you want to invest in resiliency and the future of our school children and our veterans, and have somebody who understands the great responsibility of stewarding these public lands? And I think what I'm trying to say is, I do think there are some things that we all, regardless of party, still care about. And that this office gives us an opportunity to talk about those things. And there's some progressive things in here, right? Talking about climate change and carbon sequestration and protecting the coast and all of that and the environment. But those are things, I would argue, that people from all across the spectrum and all walks of life do care about. And I'm trying to give people a reason to vote for me, not to just shut the door and say, well, that guy's crazy. That's what we're trying to do, is give them something positive for once to care about. That's a really long answer. So trust me, I have a shorter one, but like, that's how I feel about it. I really do feel about it. And the response that I've been getting, I had a veteran tell me yesterday, I guarantee you he's a Republican. Like, I just could sense it, right? And he's asking me questions. We had a thing here. I'm in Austin for a couple of days, and he heard me speak, and he sent me a note afterwards, and he said, he didn't tell me what his political affiliation was, but he said, I've kind of given up on politics. But when I heard you talk about the things, the way that you talked about them, they weren't, it wasn't overly politicized. Like, you didn't give me a reason to push you away. You gave me a reason to care. And I actually care now, and I'm excited about this. And so I think those are the kind of things that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to say, I was kind of heartbroken to hear that we could be losing our beaches 30% within 20 to 30 years from now, which means like our great grandchildren, I mean, I'm a grandma, so they won't be able to enjoy what we have enjoyed here in our area, right? Does this have to do a lot with SpaceX also?
No, then that time horizon is out a little bit further. And so I've got to go back and look. I'll send you, if you are interested, the link where I got that from. I think it might have been either the AFL-CIO Climate Jobs Project, or it might have been an EPA doc. But essentially it's out, it's a longer horizon than that. It's like 50 or 60 years. So it's a little bit further out than that. But essentially what that is just from sea level rise, frankly. A lot of it's sea level rise, and then a lot of it is just the frequency and the intensity of storms as we have seen them. I mean, if you go up to the Corpus Christi area, I don't know what it was like in Cameron County, but entire islands, and like if you know Cedar Bayou, which is up north of Corpus, there are storms over the years that have come through there and wiped out Cedar Bayou and cleaned it out. And then there are other storms that have closed it up. And so I just think you're going to see more and more of that. And we have a natural, like longshore drift naturally will take sand away from our beaches and deposit it elsewhere. But I think a lot of that sea level rise and intensity and frequency of storms.
Mhm. So what are we doing to prevent some of that? Maybe planting some seaweed around the area, or?
Yeah,
I don't
some of that is
know.
like dune. Yeah, some of it's dune replenishment. So the General Land Office, for instance, has a program right now where they're taking sand and dredge material, and where they can do it safely, they're building up the barrier islands. So that's one way. Two, you've got groups like Audubon that lease a lot of the rookery islands, and making sure that they continue to do that, because then you've got habitat for birds, and then you also have like natural infrastructure. Investing more in artificial oyster or artificial reefs to enable oyster reefs to build, and making sure that we have protections for those. So like a combination of some built infrastructure and natural infrastructure, and protecting the areas along the coast. Because I mean, it's a lot of this, we have changed the nature of the coast, therefore it's not operating the way that it used to. And we've also got essentially a coastline that's being battered on both sides by water, right? You've got these deluge rain events that, especially on the upper coast, are washing away sediment, and in some cases causing bleaching. I've seen bleaching out at Flower Gardens National Marine Sanctuary, and it wasn't because of a warming temperature. It was actually because there was so much fresh water that came into the system up there back about 10 years ago that it caused a deprivation of oxygen, and some of the coral died. It's still a healthy system, but we're just seeing things that the earth has not ever had to deal with, or hasn't dealt with in a long time, you know.
I appreciate all your wisdom and knowledge that you have shared with us today, and that has really opened up my eyes, and I appreciate everything that you're doing, and hope you win.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all, and hopefully that was on point as far as the questions that you all wanted me to answer, and then maybe a little bit more.
No, thank you. If you would like to add anything else, your website, anything like that?
Yeah, I'll put that in the chat. I'm actually trying to
drop it in the chat.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a pin here so I don't lose this. There was a address here. Well, I'll take a screenshot or something. I just don't want to miss this. Somebody asked for some signs, and so I wanted to make sure I had this here. And I'll put my website. It's JAY and then number 4 TX.com. And I would just say, don't lose faith. Like what I'm talking about, a lot of these things are seem dire, but I am hopeful because I've actually seen human will. I have seen all of us, whether it was the freeze or it was post Harvey, when we are asked to care for and take action for our neighbors, we respond as Texans, and we don't ask what party you're from. We get after it. And what I'm interested in this race is really inspiring people to get back engaged. And maybe they don't care about one race or another, but this one they say, you know, I really think that this person is reasonable and responsible, and he's qualified, and he's got a vision, and these are things that aren't fantastical. They actually can be done because there are other models for this in other parts of the state. We didn't even talk about disaster relief funds, but I think there's a way to unclog $14 billion worth of disaster relief funds that had been sitting with the GLO for the last 10 years. I know this because I talked to the people who ran the disaster relief program prior to George P. Bush taking office. And they said, Jay, it's not this hard. If Louisiana and Mississippi and Florida and New York can figure it out, then I'm pretty sure Texas can figure it out. So I have a lot of hope.
Oh, he froze.
We've got to get through the primary. Sorry, did I froze?
No.
Oh, okay. We got to get to the primary. And so get out and vote. Hopefully it's for me, but regardless, get out and vote. It starts February 14th. I know you all know all this, but we're really focused on that and really think that if I want to get into the general, because the person who is in that general, I think is going to be on the other side, is an ophthalmologist and wants to run for governor ultimately, and is endorsed by Trump and Cruz. And I know that people.
His name isn't Paul,
no.
is it?
No, it's a woman out of Lake Travis. And anyway, I know that we can create I know that we can create a deep contrast between that person and who I am. But we got to get through the primary. So anyway, again, thank you for the time, and yeah, thanks for having this, giving me this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much,